A sick little girl grabbed the billionaire's hand in the hospital, and whispered the truth that almost killed him. Michael Davenport had spent his entire adult life believing that danger could never reach him without warning. He trusted data, security systems, seasoned advisors, and his own sharp intuition, a combination that had saved him from more than one corporate betrayal. Yet nothing in his well-constructed world prepared him for the moment he found himself weakened, lying in a hospital bed in a simple blue t-shirt, his breath uneven after a violent allergic reaction that had nearly stopped his heart earlier that evening. His mind floated in and out of clarity, and for the first time in years he felt strangely defenseless, unable to rely on the sharpness that usually guided him. The soft buzz of machines and the faint scent of disinfectant filled the room, creating an illusion of safety that he desperately wanted to believe in. When the door opened, he expected to see a nurse coming in to check his vitals. Instead, two unfamiliar men stepped inside wearing white medical coats and surgical badges. They moved with the calm confidence of people who knew exactly what they were doing, but something about their presence felt slightly off, too rehearsed, too smooth, too synchronized. Michael tried to focus on their faces, but the lingering dizziness blurred his perception. One of the men approached his bedside with a clipboard, murmuring something about a required follow-up injection, while the other stood at the foot of the bed preparing a syringe filled with a cloudy, oddly tinted liquid. Michael's instincts tried to scream at him, but his body felt too heavy to respond. The man with the syringe glanced around the room, as if making sure they were alone, and then nodded subtly to his partner. Michael swallowed hard. A sharp unease cut through the fog in his mind, but before he could force himself to sit up, a small voice rose from the corner of the room, weak, hoarse, and trembling, yet filled with a strange kind of courage. "They're not doctors." The sound startled him more than anything else that had happened. He turned his head slowly and saw Claire Milton, the little girl from the neighboring bed, sitting upright with her red phone clutched in her thin hands. She was only 9 years old, with pale skin and tired blue eyes that carried far more pain than any child should know. Her blonde hair fell loosely over her shoulders, and she wore a simple red tank top and blue jeans, wrinkled from sleep. She had been coughing earlier that evening, and nurses had advised her to rest, but now she looked very much awake and terrified. The two men stiffened at the sound of her voice. Claire stood up from her chair despite the weakness in her legs and stepped closer, raising her phone so Michael could see the glowing screen. Her hands shook, but she refused to lower it. I recorded them," she said, her breath uneven. "I heard them talking in the hallway, so I started filming." Michael blinked, struggling to focus, but as the video played, the truth struck him with the force of a physical blow. On the screen, the same two men were shown standing in a supply room, removing real medical badges from their shirts and replacing them with forged ones. They pulled white coats from a bag, putting them on over black clothing, and one of them spoke in a low, cold voice, "All we need is one injection. Just get close. Make it look routine." Michael's vision cleared instantly. The men in the room exchanged a panicked look. The one holding the syringe took a step closer to Michael, as if trying to finish the job quickly, while the other moved toward Claire with an expression that made her grip her phone even tighter. For a moment, time felt suspended, stretched thin with tension. Michael tried to push himself up, his muscles trembling with the effort, but his body refused to cooperate. The room spun, the heartbeat monitor beeped erratically, and the world narrowed into a single terrifying realization. If Claire hadn't spoken, he would already be dead. The man nearest Claire hissed, "Give me the phone," and reached toward her with a sharp, threatening movement. Claire stumbled back, her breath hitching, but she didn't stop holding up the evidence. She looked from the man to Michael, her eyes pleading not for safety, but for him to believe her. "I'm telling the truth," she whispered, her voice nearly breaking. "They want to hurt you." And in that moment, fragile, urgent, horrifying, Michael understood with absolute clarity that the only person in the room trying to save him was the sick, frightened child standing just a few feet away. The moment Claire's trembling voice cut through the room, everything shifted from slow, dreamlike confusion into sharp, chaotic clarity. Michael watched the man with the syringe hesitate for only a fraction of a second, but that tiny pause gave the scene enough tension to snap like a taut wire. The second man lunged toward Claire, his arm shooting out as if he meant to snatch the phone straight from her hands. She flinched back with a frightened gasp, but her fingers tightened around the device with a desperation that made Michael's heart jolt. He tried to push himself up, to shout, to stop them, but his body felt trapped in its own weakness. The allergic attack he'd suffered had drained his strength like water spilling through cracked glass, leaving him barely able to lift his head. Then the corridor outside erupted in hurried footsteps, and a moment later the door swung open with force. A real nurse stepped inside, her face going pale as she took in the scene, a paralyzed billionaire, two unfamiliar doctors out of uniform protocol, a child cornered in fear, and a syringe lying suspiciously close to the man's hand. Her scream filled the room, ripping through the threat like a blade. One of the imposters snapped something under his breath, a curse sharp with panic, and the distraction was all Claire needed to react. Without thinking, she threw her phone at the man advancing on her. It wasn't an elegant move, but it was enough to knock his hand aside and send him stumbling. Michael felt a spark of adrenaline surge through him. He slammed his hand onto the large red emergency button attached to his bedside. The alarm blared instantly, a harsh, shrill sound that flooded the room and echoed down the corridor. Both intruders stiffened. One turned toward the window as if calculating an escape, while the other bent down in a last desperate attempt to grab the syringe from the floor. But security was already pounding down the hallway, drawn by the alarm and the nurse's scream. The room became a storm of motion. Hospital security officers rushed in, tackling the first man and pinning him against the wall. The second tried to dodge, but a guard caught his arm and twisted the syringe out of his grasp before forcing him to the ground. The nurse backed away, trembling violently, one hand pressed over her mouth as if she couldn't process the nightmare unfolding in front of her. Claire remained frozen near the corner, her chest rising and falling quickly, her small hands clasped together as if she feared the slightest movement might set everything spiraling again. Within seconds, both imposters were handcuffed and dragged from the room, shouting incoherent denials that no one listened to. The door slammed behind them, and silence flooded the space in a crashing wave. For a long moment, the only sound was the rapid beeping of Michael's heart monitor, reflecting the sheer terror still clenching inside him. Claire took a step toward him, her movements unsteady, and her blonde hair fell across her face as she lowered her gaze. When she finally spoke, her voice cracked. I saw them in the hallway," she whispered. "They didn't talk like doctors. They were laughing about something, and then I heard them say your name. I got scared, so I hid and started recording on my phone because I didn't know what else to do." Michael felt his throat tighten. The child standing in front of him had done what adults twice her size and decades older had failed to do. She had noticed danger when everyone else had walked past it and had acted despite her fear. He forced himself to sit up a little, wincing at the weakness in his muscles, but needing to look her in the eyes. "You saved me," he said, his voice rough from both the attack and the shock. "Claire, you saved my life." Her eyes lifted slowly, shimmering with uncertainty, as if she wasn't sure whether he meant the words or whether she had caused more harm than good. She clutched her hands together and swallowed hard. "I just didn't want them to hurt you," she said. "I know I'm not supposed to get involved or cause trouble, but it felt wrong to just sit there and pretend I didn't hear anything." Michael shook his head, feeling a surge of emotion he could barely identify: gratitude, awe, protectiveness, something deeper and far more profound than a simple thank you could express. He wanted to say more, but another figure entered the room, Claire's mother. She froze at the sight of security guards lingering outside, her eyes widening in horror as she rushed to her daughter and pulled her close. "Oh my God, Claire, what happened? Are you all right? Did they touch you? Are you hurt?" Her voice cracked as she inspected her daughter frantically. Claire clung to her for a moment, then pulled back enough to point toward Michael. "They were going to hurt him," she said. "So I told him. And then, everything happened so fast." Her mother looked at Michael with a mixture of confusion, fear, and apology, as if she expected him to be furious that her daughter had interfered. But Michael only shook his head again, slowly, firmly. "She saved my life," he said quietly. "Your daughter is the reason I'm still here." Claire's mother pressed a trembling hand to her mouth as tears filled her eyes. The nurse returned, now composed enough to speak, though her voice carried a shaky edge. She promised that the police were already waiting downstairs, that an investigation would begin immediately, and that Michael was safe. But even as she spoke, Michael barely listened. His focus remained on the girl standing beside her mother, still breathing quickly, still scared, yet unbelievably brave. For the first time in years, Michael realized that he owed someone something far bigger than money, or influence, or thanks. He owed this fragile, courageous child his life. Michael barely slept that night. Even after the police arrived, after the imposters were taken away in handcuffs, after the doctors confirmed he was no longer in immediate danger, his mind stayed wide awake, replaying the scene again and again. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the syringe hovering inches from his skin, heard Claire's frightened voice cutting through the fog, felt the panic rising in his chest when his body refused to move. The danger had been so close, closer than he dared admit. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized that without Claire's intervention, he would have been lying in a morgue instead of a hospital bed. The thought shook him deeply, not because he feared death, but because he had come so close to losing everything without even realizing it. By early morning the haze of exhaustion had settled into a sharp, jittery awareness. He requested access to the hospital security footage, his company's legal team, and any records the police could share. The investigation had already begun, but Michael Davenport was not a man who waited passively for answers. He wanted to know who had sent those men, how they got into his room, and what exactly they had planned to inject him with. As detectives pored over files and questioned staff, Michael forced himself to focus, though his thoughts kept drifting back to the frail little girl who had saved him. A nurse finally entered his room with a tablet full of reports, but paused when she saw him rubbing his forehead in silent frustration. Her expression softened. She told him that Claire had asked about him twice already that morning. He felt something inside him loosen at those words, some mix of tenderness and disbelief. He wasn't used to people worrying about him in such a genuine way. A few hours later, after Michael had been cleared to move around briefly, he walked slowly down the hallway, leaning slightly on the railing for balance. When he reached Claire's room, he found the door partly open. Her mother sat on a chair near the bed, her hands wrapped around a paper cup of cold coffee, looking worn out but alert. Claire herself was awake, propped up by pillows, her red tank top slightly wrinkled, her blonde hair messy from sleep. She was scrolling through her phone with a seriousness that didn't fit her age. When she noticed him standing in the doorway, her eyes widened, then softened into something shy and relieved. Michael knocked gently before stepping in. Her mother immediately rose from her chair, almost stumbling in her rush to stand. She apologized, flustered, insisting that Claire knew she shouldn't have been recording strangers in the hospital, that she shouldn't have interfered, that she must have frightened him. But Michael raised a hand and shook his head. "She didn't frighten me," he said quietly. "She saved me." Claire lowered her gaze, fiddling with the edge of her blanket. Her mother placed a hand on her shoulder, torn between pride and fear, unsure how much trouble her daughter might be in. Michael pulled a chair beside Claire's bed and sat down slowly, still feeling the weakness from the attack. Up close he could see how pale she was and how her breathing sometimes hitched in her chest, but there was a steadiness in her expression that made her seem older than her 9 years. Her blue eyes, though tired, held a clarity he rarely saw even in adults. "You were very brave last night," he said softly, choosing each word carefully. "You did something most people wouldn't dare to do." Claire bit her lip and looked away. I didn't feel brave, she murmured. I was scared. Being scared doesn't make you less brave, Michael replied. It makes you honest. She glanced back at him, uncertain yet hopeful. He leaned forward, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret meant only for her. Claire, if you hadn't said anything, I might not be here right now. Her small fingers trembled slightly, but she nodded. I knew something was wrong. They didn't look like real doctors. They didn't talk like them either. I heard them in the hallway, laughing, and then they said your name. I didn't understand everything, but something felt bad. So I hid behind the curtains and started filming. Mom says it's rude to record people without asking, but I was scared for you. Her mother closed her eyes briefly, fighting tears. Michael reached out carefully and rested his hand on Claire's, mindful of how fragile she was. Her skin felt cool, almost delicate, but she didn't pull away. You did something extraordinary, he said. You trusted your instincts. You saw danger before anyone else did, and you acted when others wouldn't have. Claire swallowed hard. I thought maybe no one would believe me. I believe you, Michael said. And I always will. Something in her face changed at those words, a subtle but powerful shift, like a child who had spent too much time being dismissed finally realizing that someone truly saw her. A soft knock sounded at the door. A detective entered with a folder and explained that the two imposters had confessed during preliminary questioning. They were hired by Jason Marlowe, Michael's former business partner, someone he had fired years ago for embezzlement. Marlowe had planned everything meticulously, the forged badges, the fake coats, the timing of the injection. The detective paused before continuing, saying the substance in the syringe had been sent to a lab, but early tests suggested it wasn't medication at all. Michael felt a coldness spread through his veins as the truth settled in. Claire noticed his expression and whispered, I'm really glad they didn't hurt you. He looked at her again, truly looked, and something inside him shifted, an emotional weight he had carried alone for years finally moved. Claire, he said softly, you are the reason I'm alive. She blinked slowly, absorbing the words with a seriousness far beyond her age. Her mother wiped her eyes and whispered, we're just glad she wasn't the one hurt. Michael shook his head gently. No one should ever expect a child to protect an adult. But you did. And I won't forget that. Claire's lips curved into a tiny, tired smile, the kind of smile that carried pride, relief, and lingering fear all at once. And in that quiet hospital room, with machines humming softly and sunlight filtering through the blinds, Michael realized something that would shape the next chapter of his life. He wasn't just indebted to Claire. He was responsible for her safety, her future, and the fragile hope she carried inside her chest. Because sometimes the smallest, weakest voices expose the largest dangers. And sometimes a child becomes the only reason a man survives. Michael returned to his hospital room after speaking with the detectives, but the silence felt heavier than before. Everything in the room, the softly beeping monitors, the folded blanket, the sterile smell, reminded him how close he had come to losing his life. He sat on the edge of the bed, running a hand across his face, trying to steady the mixture of anger, fear, and disbelief swirling inside him. He had survived hostile takeovers, lawsuits, and calculated betrayals, but nothing compared to the quiet terror of lying helpless while someone prepared to inject him with something that would have ended everything he had built. He realized, with a clarity that made his chest tighten, that without Claire's trembling voice and shaky recording, no one would have questioned a medical accident. He would have disappeared quietly, neatly, efficiently. After a while, his doctor entered, explaining the results of his tests and the plan for the next few days. Michael listened, nodding where appropriate, but his thoughts wandered. His doctor eventually paused and asked if he was all right. Michael answered honestly, he didn't know. The doctor reassured him that the worst was over and left, promising to return later. But as soon as the door clicked shut, Michael felt suffocated by the loneliness in the room. For the first time in years, he wished for someone to talk to, not a board member, not a lawyer, not a doctor. Someone who cared about him simply because he was human. He found himself standing slowly, gripping the four-pole for balance as he walked back toward Claire's room. He didn't announce himself this time. Instead, he stopped at the doorway and observed. Claire was asleep now, curled under a thin blanket, her blonde hair spilling across the pillow in tangled strands. Her breathing was soft and uneven, reflecting the fragility of her body. Her mother sat beside the bed, eyes closed, exhausted from the emotional storm of the past 24 hours. The lamp by the bedside cast a warm glow across the room, making the small space feel strangely peaceful. Michael hesitated, unsure whether he should enter, but Claire's mother noticed him and motioned gently for him to come in. He stepped closer, lowering his voice so as not to disturb the girl. "How is she?" he asked. Her mother sighed softly, brushing a hand through Claire's hair. She said the stress had taken a toll on Claire's condition. Her illness always worsened when she was frightened or overwhelmed, and last night had been terrifying for her. The doctors were adjusting her treatment and monitoring her closely, but exhaustion was still weighing heavily on her little body. Michael felt a knot form in his chest. He hated knowing she had suffered because of what she'd done for him. Her mother looked at him then, and her expression softened with gratitude and confusion. She admitted she couldn't understand why her daughter had reacted so quickly or bravely. Claire usually froze around danger. But something about Michael's vulnerability must have struck her deeply. She had acted before fear could stop her. Michael sat down in the chair beside Claire's bed. He studied her small hands resting on the blanket. They were tiny, delicate, almost translucent in places where the hospital light shone through them. He wondered how those hands had held the phone so tightly while they shook with fear. He wondered how a 9-year-old, already worn down by sickness, had found the strength to be braver than any adult in that hallway. After a few quiet minutes, Claire stirred. Her eyelids fluttered open and she blinked several times, disoriented. When she realized Michael was sitting there, a small, sleepy smile appeared on her pale face. "Oh," she whispered. "You're still here." Her mother gently encouraged her to rest, but Claire shook her head weakly and reached out her hand toward Michael. He didn't hesitate to take it. Her grip was faint but warm. "I wanted to see if you were okay," she murmured. Michael swallowed. "I should be the one asking you that." She gave a tiny shrug. "I'm tired. But I'm glad you didn't, get hurt." Her eyes filled with something like guilt, as if she believed that his condition was somehow her fault. He squeezed her hand gently. "Claire, what happened wasn't because of you. It was because someone else made terrible choices. You did the right thing. You did the bravest thing." She took a slow breath, absorbing his words with visible relief. After a moment she whispered, "I thought, if I didn't say anything, nobody would know. And I'd always wonder if I could have helped." "You did help," Michael said quietly. "More than anyone else." Her mother's voice cracked when she thanked him for being kind to Claire, for sitting with her, for speaking to her with a gentleness few people offered. But Michael shook his head lightly, still watching Claire. "She's the one who deserves thanks," he said. Claire smiled again, though her eyelids were growing heavy. She released his hand only when she grew too tired to keep holding it, and within seconds she drifted back to sleep. Her breathing steadied, and a sense of calm filled the room. As he sat there watching her rest, Michael realized something he hadn't admitted even to himself. The fear he had felt wasn't just about almost dying. It was about the sudden, overwhelming awareness that this small, sick girl, this stranger, had cared enough to risk everything to save him. And now, he felt a responsibility toward her that he couldn't explain away. Not an obligation born from guilt, not a promise made out of gratitude, but a quiet, powerful desire to protect her just as she had protected him. For the first time in a long while, Michael felt a shift inside him, a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with business or success. He wasn't just recovering from an attack. He was beginning something entirely new. Michael was discharged from the hospital 2 days later, but the moment he stepped outside, he realized the world felt different in a way that unsettled him more than any medical diagnosis could. Everything, the noise of traffic, the brightness of sunlight, the rush of people, felt louder and sharper, as if life had turned up its volume while he had been lying defenseless in a hospital bed. His driver opened the door to the black SUV waiting for him, but instead of climbing inside, Michael looked back toward the building. He wasn't ready to leave Claire behind, not when he owed her more than words could ever express. He promised himself he would return later in the day, and only then allowed the car door to close behind him. At home, his large penthouse felt unusually cold, despite the warm lighting and polished decor. Everything inside was arranged with precision, designed for efficiency, success, and status, yet none of it offered comfort. He walked slowly through the rooms, touching furniture, passing framed awards and photos, but nothing stirred familiarity. For years he had built a world that kept people at a distance, a fortress built of wealth and logic, and now, for the first time, that world felt unbearably empty. He found himself thinking of Claire's small hand gripping his, the tremble in her voice, the courage in her frightened eyes. She had seen danger and acted, something even trained adults had failed to do. Michael spent the next few hours reviewing reports from his security team. They had uncovered alarming details about the impersonators' backgrounds, men who had been paid generously for silence and precision. They were known to authorities but had slipped through the system long enough to collaborate with Jason Marlowe. Financial records confirmed that Marlowe had been planning this for months, waiting for the perfect moment when Michael was weakest. Reading through the files, Michael felt a chill settle deep in his bones as he realized how thoroughly his trust had been exploited. The betrayal didn't just shake his business stability, it struck at the core of his personal life. Marlowe could have attacked him in many ways, but he had chosen the one moment when Michael could neither fight nor run. That cruelty made Michael's jaw tighten. But every time he felt himself being pulled into anger, a softer memory returned. Claire standing in that hospital room with her phone raised, her breath trembling, her eyes wide but steady. He remembered how small she looked compared to the men approaching her, how she clutched her recording even though fear made her legs wobble. That memory kept his thoughts from spiraling into rage. She had given him the truth when he couldn't defend himself. She had done what his entire security team, with all their training and resources, had missed. By late afternoon he couldn't stay away any longer. He returned to the hospital, ignoring the curious glances of staff and visitors. When he reached Claire's room, he hesitated in the doorway just as he had the day before. Claire was awake this time, sitting cross-legged on her bed with a coloring book in front of her. She looked better, still pale but less fragile, her messy blonde hair tied into a loose ponytail. Her mother sat beside her, helping her separate the marker caps she always managed to mix up. The moment Claire saw him, she perked up with a small but genuine smile. It warmed something in him instantly. "You came back," she said, sounding both surprised and relieved. "Of course I did," Michael replied, pulling a chair closer to her bed. "How are you feeling today?" "Better," Claire said proudly. "They said my fever went down. And I got to eat pudding. 2 of them." Her mother sighed. "Only one was allowed." Claire leaned toward Michael with a conspiratorial whisper. "But the nurse gave me an extra because she felt bad." Michael chuckled softly. The sound surprised him, he hadn't realized how tense he'd been until the laughter loosened something inside him. He placed a small gift bag on her bedside table. Claire's eyes widened, and her mother immediately began to protest that he didn't need to bring anything, but Michael shook his head gently. Inside the bag was a plush bear, soft, brown, and wearing tiny scrubs with a toy stethoscope stitched onto its chest. Claire gasped, pulling it out with a joy so pure it made Michael's eyes sting unexpectedly. "He's a Dr. Bear," she exclaimed. "But, like, a real one. Not like those scary fake ones." "Exactly," Michael said, warmth spreading through him. "He's here to protect you. Just like you protected me." Claire hugged the bear tightly. "I'm gonna name him Davenport Jr." Her mother groaned in embarrassment, but Michael laughed again, touched in a way he didn't know how to hide. As the afternoon passed, Claire talked about her favorite books, her dreams of becoming a nurse or doctor, the way she collected stickers from every hospital visit, and how she sometimes pretended her stuffed animals were her patients. Michael listened without interruption, surprised by how naturally her presence eased the lingering fear inside him. She asked him questions too, about his work, his hobbies, and whether he had always been brave. The last question caught him off guard. "I don't think bravery is something you always feel," he said after a moment of thought. "Sometimes it's something you choose, even when you're afraid." Claire nodded seriously. "That's what it felt like. Like, my legs were shaking, and I wanted to hide, but I also didn't want you to die." Her voice trembled slightly at the last word, and her mother's hand immediately reached for hers. Michael's heart tightened. "You didn't let fear stop you," he said. "That's what makes you brave." Claire watched him quietly, absorbing the words like they were more precious than the plush bear she still held in her arms. Her eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. She seemed too proud for that. When visiting hours neared their end, Claire's mother thanked Michael again, but he shook his head. "I should be thanking her," he said softly. Before he left, Claire reached out her small hand and grabbed his. "Are you gonna come back tomorrow?" she asked, her voice hopeful but hesitant, as if she feared the answer. Michael squeezed her hand gently, feeling an emotion he hadn't felt in years, a sense of connection, of purpose that wasn't tied to success or money. "Yes," he said. "I will." As he walked out of the room, he realized something important. Claire wasn't just recovering. She was pulling him back to life as well. She saved him in more ways than one. Michael returned to the hospital every day that week, and with each visit he found himself staying longer, talking more, and listening with a kind of patience he didn't know he possessed. Work emails piled up on his phone, unanswered and increasingly irrelevant. Board members demanded updates, but he ignored them all with a calmness that would have shocked anyone who knew the old him. The man who once lived by schedules and spreadsheets now spent his afternoons sitting beside a frail little girl, helping her color, reading to her, or simply keeping her company while she rested. And strangely, he felt more himself in that quiet hospital room than he had felt in years. Claire's recovery was steady but not easy. Her condition, always unpredictable, had worsened after the events of that terrifying night. She grew exhausted quickly, her energy draining in waves she couldn't control, and sometimes she fought dizziness that made her clutch Michael's hand just to stay grounded. Michael stayed through all of it, watching the bravery she displayed even in mundane moments. She never complained, even when nurses administered medications that made her nauseous or when machines beeped in ways she hated. Instead, she would squeeze her Dr. Bear and whisper to it that they were both going to be okay. During one of his visits, Michael arrived to find Claire asleep, her small face pale, her breathing shallow but steady. Her mother whispered a greeting, looking more tired than he had ever seen her. The exhaustion in her eyes, years of holding the world together on too little money, too little help, and far too much worry, hit him more deeply than any financial report ever had. She thanked him again for visiting, for caring, for not treating them like a burden, but Michael stopped her gently. He wasn't doing any of this out of obligation. He was there because he wanted to be, because something about Claire and her mother had cut through the armor he had built around himself. When Claire woke, she reached for him instinctively, rubbing her eyes with the back of her hand before offering him a sleepy smile. She asked if he would read to her, and he nodded immediately. She picked a book with worn pages and a bent spine, a story about a girl who wanted to become a doctor and travel the world curing rare diseases. Michael smoothed the pages carefully and began reading, his voice low and steady. Claire listened intently at first, then rested her head on his arm, eyes drifting shut. Even after she fell asleep again, he kept reading softly, more for himself than for her, because the sound of his own voice seemed to quiet the noise in his mind. Later that day, a doctor sat down with him to explain the complexity of Claire's illness. It wasn't life-ending, but it was life-changing, a chronic condition requiring long-term treatment, expensive medication, and constant monitoring. Her mother could barely afford rent, let alone the full medical plan Claire needed. Michael listened to the doctor's explanation with a tightening chest, feeling a surge of anger, not at Claire or her mother, but at the cruelty of a system that let a child's future hinge on money she didn't have. As soon as the doctor left, Michael turned to Claire's mother, who was busy tidying the small space around the bed, trying to distract herself from the weight of the discussion. "How long have you been managing this alone?" he asked quietly. She froze, her hands stilling on the blanket. She admitted that Claire had been diagnosed years ago, and since then she had worked 2 jobs, cleaning during the day and managing inventory at night. Some months they chose between medication and groceries. Some months Claire hid her symptoms to keep her mom from panicking. The woman's voice cracked when she said she always feared the day she wouldn't be able to give her daughter what she needed. Michael listened without interrupting. Not once did she ask him for money, help, or pity. She simply explained, her voice trembling with the vulnerability of someone who had run out of places to hide the truth. When Claire woke again, Michael was the first person she looked at. Her face brightened, and she showed him a drawing she had made the previous evening, a crooked hospital bed, a girl with messy hair, and a tall man standing beside her. Above them she'd written, "Safe now." Michael felt his throat tighten. Something powerful had shifted inside him over the past week, something he hadn't fully understood until now. He realized that Claire's world was small, fragile, and barely held together. She had no safety net, no certainty, no guarantees. And yet, she had risked everything to save him. He decided that he would not allow her life to remain uncertain. That afternoon, after stepping outside to make several phone calls, he returned to Claire's room with a quiet but resolute expression. Claire was drawing again, humming under her breath, but her mother noticed his serious demeanor instantly and stood up. "Is something wrong?" she asked. "No," Michael said, shaking his head. "But things are going to change." He sat beside Claire, taking one of her drawings in his hand. "I want to help," he said softly. "Not just with hospital bills. I want to make sure you get the care you need, the education you deserve, and the life you dream about." Her mother immediately protested, flustered and overwhelmed, insisting that she couldn't accept something so immense, that she didn't want charity, that Michael didn't owe them anything. But he met her gaze steadily. "This isn't charity," he said. "This is thanks. And respect. Claire saved my life. The least I can do is help her live hers the way she deserves." Claire looked between them, confused at first, then hopeful in a way that hit him like sunlight breaking through heavy clouds. "You mean, you'll help me get better?" she whispered. Michael reached out, gently squeezing her hand. "Yes. I'll help with all of it." Her eyes filled with tears, not fear, not sadness, but something deeper, brighter, almost disbelieving. "You're really being serious?" she asked. "I am," he said. "Completely." She hugged him then, her arms weak but tight around his chest, and whispered, "Then I'm not scared anymore." And for the first time since that awful night, Michael realized that he wasn't scared anymore either. Because helping Claire wasn't just an obligation. It was a purpose. And he hadn't felt purposeful in a very long time. Michael hadn't expected the investigation to grow as large or as public as it did, but once federal authorities stepped in, everything expanded far beyond the quiet hospital corridor where the truth had first surfaced. What began as an attempted medical assault quickly unraveled into a sprawling case involving forged credentials, complex financial motives, and a criminal network that had been operating right under his company's radar. Michael attended every briefing he could, even when fatigue from his recovery tugged at him, because the deeper the investigators dug, the more he understood just how deliberately he had been targeted. It wasn't a crime of opportunity, it was a long, calculated attempt to remove him permanently. And through every stark realization and every unsettling report, the image of Claire, the small girl holding her phone with shaking hands, returned to him like a guiding light. The prosecutors were fascinated by Claire's video. In legal terms, it was a gold mine: clear audio, clear images, clear proof of intent. Without her recording, everything would have looked like a tragic medical accident. Michael felt shivers each time he imagined the alternate timeline, a world where he never woke up again, a world where his company collapsed under manufactured chaos, a world where Claire's bravery came too late. That frightening possibility made him even more determined to see justice carried out properly. When the case reached the first major hearing, Michael insisted on being present despite his doctor's protests. The courtroom buzzed with reporters, attorneys, and investigators. The two fake doctors were brought in, their expressions equal parts defiant and defeated. Jason Marlowe, the architect of the plan, sat further away, cuffed and expressionless, though his jaw tightened each time Michael lifted his gaze toward him. The prosecutor outlined the events in detailed chronological order, describing the forged badges, the infiltrated hospital access, the intercepted payments, and finally, the incriminating video Claire had recorded. Michael had expected the court to treat Claire's involvement gently, given her age, but he hadn't anticipated how seriously they took her bravery. The prosecutor referred to her as the key witness whose quick thinking and moral courage prevented a homicide. Several jurors visibly softened upon hearing that. Reporters scribbled notes frantically. Claire herself sat silently in the front row, her legs swinging nervously above the floor, her mother's hand holding hers tightly. She wore a simple red shirt and jeans, her blonde hair brushed neatly for the occasion, but nothing about her appearance revealed the immensity of what she had done. When the court asked Claire to speak briefly, not as formal testimony, but as acknowledgement of her involvement, Michael felt protective panic grip him. He wanted to stand, to tell them she didn't need to say anything more, that she'd done enough. But Claire surprised him yet again. She stood up slowly, her knees wobbling, and looked directly at the judge with an earnestness that made the entire room still. She explained how she had overheard the men in the hallway, how they had whispered Michael's name, how something in her heart had told her their words weren't right. She said she recorded them because she felt she had to, because grown-ups sometimes ignored things that children noticed. And then, in a small but steady voice, she said the words that would echo through every news outlet for weeks. "I didn't want him to die. He looked scared. And I thought, if I don't help him, who will?" The courtroom fell into utter silence. Even hardened detectives looked away, blinking quickly. Michael felt his throat tighten with a mixture of pride, grief, and overwhelming gratitude. Claire wasn't just brave. She was something much rarer, she was good. The judge thanked her personally, his voice unusually gentle, and excused her from further participation. Claire let out a tiny breath of relief and sat down, leaning instinctively toward Michael. He reached across the aisle and took her hand for a brief moment, squeezing it in silent reassurance. She smiled at him, small and tired, but proud. As the trial continued, the evidence stacked so heavily against the defendants that even their own attorneys seemed resigned. When the judge announced that the case would move decisively toward conviction, murmurs rippled through the court. Michael felt the tension he had been carrying for weeks begin to ease for the first time. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed the steps, cameras flashing like lightning, but Michael shielded Claire with his body and refused to give any statement until she and her mother were safely inside the car waiting for them. Only when they were gone did he speak briefly to the press, stating that justice must be done, that the truth had prevailed, and that he owed his life to a little girl who had more courage than most adults he had ever met. Later that evening, Michael visited their apartment, carrying a bag filled with groceries and a few small gifts for Claire, nothing extravagant, just things she liked, things that made her smile. Claire opened the door herself, her energy still fragile but her eyes lighting up instantly when she saw him. She ran into the kitchen to show him a drawing she had made of the courtroom, a crooked judge's bench, stick figures in handcuffs, and in the center, a stick figure version of herself holding a phone like a superhero with a shield. "I made me braver in the picture," she said shyly, holding it up to him. Michael knelt down to her eye level and said, "You didn't need to make yourself braver, Claire. You already are." Her cheeks flushed pink, and she hugged him tightly, pressing her face into his shoulder. That night, as he helped her mother fix dinner, something settled deeply within him. Claire had saved his life, but she had done more than that. She had pierced the isolation he had built for years, opening a place inside him he thought had long since gone numb. Watching her laugh at the dinner table, her illness momentarily forgotten, he felt a sense of clarity he hadn't known he needed. He wasn't just seeking justice anymore. He was seeking a future, one where Claire would never again have to be afraid, or alone, or unprotected. The hearing had given him something more valuable than closure. It had given him purpose. And purpose was something Michael Davenport had been quietly starving for, without ever realizing it. Michael didn't realize how much time had passed until he found himself standing once again at the entrance of the hospital, not as a patient, not as someone fighting for his life, but as a man ready to make a decision that would change another life forever. The case was nearly concluded, Marlowe was awaiting sentencing, and the threats against him had finally subsided. His company was stabilizing again, his name was cleared, and the world expected him to return to the fast-paced rhythm of power and business. But the truth was that after everything that had happened, the noise of his old world felt meaningless. He didn't crave boardrooms or speeches or celebrations. What his mind returned to, over and over, was a small hospital room where a brave girl had once held up her shaking phone and saved him. Claire had been discharged 2 weeks prior. Her health was improving with proper treatment, but her mother still worried constantly, about money, about Claire's future, about everything a parent with too few resources and too much love fears late at night. Michael had continued visiting them almost daily. At first he convinced himself it was to check on Claire's recovery. Then he admitted it was because he simply didn't want to imagine his life without her in it. She had become a permanent point of light in his days, grounding him in a way nothing else ever had. On the day he went to see her again, he carried no gifts, no files, no plans tucked into folders. Just a quiet determination that had been growing inside him since the moment Claire had testified in court. When Claire opened the door, she immediately brightened, throwing her arms around him with the kind of instinctive trust that felt like a small miracle each time. She tugged him inside eagerly, showing him the latest drawing she'd made, a picture of a tall man with blue eyes standing beside a blonde girl holding a superhero cape. Claire explained in an adorably serious voice that it wasn't really a cape, just a big blanket she liked, but she pretended it made her stronger. As she talked, Michael realized how small their apartment truly was: thin walls, flickering lights, second-hand furniture softened by age. It wasn't unsafe, but it was fragile, held together by love and exhaustion. Claire's mother stood in the doorway to the kitchen, wiping flour from her hands, offering him a weary smile. She invited him to sit, but he remained standing for a moment, steadying his thoughts before speaking. He asked Claire's mother if they could talk. She nodded, sensing something serious, and invited him to sit at the warm kitchen table. Claire, sensing the tone shift, retreated quietly to the living room with her bear, giving the adult space with a maturity that made her seem older than her 9 years. Michael began with gratitude, the kind that came from deep inside, not the polite kind people used in business. He thanked her for raising a child so compassionate, so perceptive, so brave. He thanked her for trusting him around Claire. He thanked her for everything she had done alone, without support, without recognition. As he spoke, Claire's mother's eyes filled with tears, though she blinked them away quickly, and used to accepting praise. Then he told her the truth, that he couldn't stop worrying about Claire, even after the case ended, that he couldn't ignore how fragile her life had been for so long, that he didn't want to be a distant benefactor or occasional visitor. He wanted to take real responsibility. Not because he pitied them, not because he felt indebted, but because Claire had become someone he genuinely cared for, someone he inherently wanted to protect. Her mother listened in silence, her hands trembling slightly. When Michael finally said the words he had rehearsed in his mind for days, his voice softened. "I want to help her build a future. A real one. I want to make sure she never goes without proper care, or resources, or safety again. And if you're willing, I'd like to be part of her life in a permanent way. Not taking her away from you, never that. Just being family. You and Claire both." Claire's mother stared at him, stunned. Concern flickered in her eyes, but not fear, more like disbelief that someone as powerful as Michael Davenport could mean something so heartfelt. She asked him why he would want to commit to something so big, so life-changing, involving a child who wasn't his. Michael didn't hesitate. "Because she saved me. And because the moment she did, my life stopped belonging only to me." That answer dissolved any remaining distance between them. Claire's mother cried, quietly, but openly, her relief breaking through years of tension. She told him she had spent nights wondering who would care for Claire if anything ever happened to her. She admitted that she had no family to help, no savings, and no stability to offer her daughter beyond pure determination. And now, this man who owed her nothing was offering everything she had been praying for without saying a word of it aloud. When the conversation ended, Claire's mother called Claire into the kitchen. The girl approached cautiously, clutching the bear Michael had given her weeks earlier. She looked at him with those clear blue eyes that had saved his life, waiting to understand the shift in the air. Michael crouched down so he was eye level with her and spoke softly, letting her hear the sincerity in every word. He told her he wanted to be there for her, not just at the hospital, not just on good days, but for all the days. He wanted to help her study, help her grow, help her follow her dreams of becoming a doctor. He wanted to support her life the way she had protected his. Claire listened carefully, her expression shifting from confusion to awe to a trembling sort of happiness. Then, as if no other reaction made sense, she threw her arms around his neck and held him with a strength that startled him. "So, you're not going anywhere," she whispered. "Not unless you tell me to," he said gently. She shook her head fiercely. "I won't. Ever." Her mother smiled through tears, and in that small kitchen, with old wallpaper and flickering lights, something extraordinary happened. A new family formed, not from blood, not from obligation, but from shared courage and the kind of love that is born from surviving the unimaginable together. Over the next weeks, Michael helped them move into a safer, brighter apartment. He arranged the best specialists for Claire, enrolled her in a school where she would be supported, and made sure her mother never had to work herself to exhaustion again. But more importantly, he became a constant presence in Claire's life, not a hero, not a billionaire, just someone who cared. And Claire blossomed under that safety. Her color returned, her strength grew, her laughter became more frequent and less fragile. She called Michael whenever she learned something new, whenever she felt scared, whenever she had a dream she wanted to share. Their bond deepened, not because of the danger they had escaped, but because of the life they were building together. One afternoon, months later, Claire ran toward him in the park where they often walked. She waved a paper above her head, a school project labeled, "My Hero." He braced himself to see a drawing of himself, but when she handed it to him, he froze. It was a picture of the two of them, Michael unconscious in the hospital bed, Claire holding her phone defiantly between herself and the imposters, and beneath it she had written, "We saved each other." Michael felt emotion rise so powerfully he had to steady himself. He pulled Claire into a hug, grateful beyond words. She was right. She had saved his life. He had saved her future. And together, they had saved something even greater, hope. Their story did not end with danger. It began with love.